Hello and welcome to British Cartographic Society Teatime Talk. My name is Chris Tributis. I am the coordinator for the Teatime Talks and today's chair. Today we have three speakers. That's Clare Seldon, Richard Carpenter, and Nick Millea. So to get us started, I'm going to pass you over to Clare.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, BCS, for setting all these up for us so that we can get together like this and talk about maps, which is what we all like. Right, I am just going to share my screen. I've got a few slides first that I'm going to go through, and then a little video that I want to share with you as well. So, right, so today I'm going to be talking a little bit about The Island by Stephen Walter. So, however much I actually believe this quote, by Robert Lucy, that everybody must care for maps, I still struggled when asked to do a map memoir to come up with a map to talk about today. People have talked about ones that shaped their career, inspired them, or had a lasting memory of as a child. I got into cartography during my geography A level, but it was more about making maps themselves than seeing a map in my formative years and thinking that's what I wanted to do. I kind of fell into it through geography, made a nice map, got a really good comment from my teacher, and went, oh, well, maybe I can do this as a career. Like, that was kind of the journey that I took. So when I then kind of realized I wasn't great at drawing and that computers could actually help me do that, that's kind of where cartography helped, and it's a bit more about making them myself than getting that my artistic desire. I could still get that through computers and making maps than not actually being able to draw very well, even though I felt artistic. And then I suddenly realized when I was trying to think of something to talk about, that I had maps all around my home that not only brought back lovely memories if people had bought them for me, but also had all sorts of memories I could recall from gazing at them and recalling my life whilst in that location. I was rewatching Mick Ashworth's Teatime Talk that's on our YouTube channel just the other day, and was like, yes, that's how I feel about these things as well. There's lots of memories that you suddenly spring up when you look at this map and you're like, I remember myself being there, and that's kind of what my talk's going to be a little bit about today. So I hope this showcase brings back some memories of your own that you hold dear to you too while looking at this map of London. So here is The Island by Stephen Walter from 2008. Stephen's map shows Greater London as a sprawling metropolis and refers to the perception of London as culturally distinct from the rest of the UK. I started working in London in January 2008 while still living in the commuter belt. And so this map came about just as I was starting my education of what London was really like, having only ever experienced it before that as a tourist, having grown up in North Cambridgeshire in the Fens. London was a far off place to me. So this is the map as a whole, and this is one small extract of the around Westminster area, so you get a feel of what the map's about and what it really looks like. So within that first year of starting work at Steer in London, so I've been there 15 years now, we then had the 2008 banking crisis, and we had to continue living in High Wycombe in that outskirts commuter belt area. Commuting in, and as first-time buyers really struggled to get mortgages, and at the time we were kind of stuck there in our little one-bed house that we'd invested in a few years before that when I was working over in Aylesbury. So this then gave us the opportunity, although we were kind of stuck there, to visit lots of friends who were renting in London and got to explore lots of different areas that we might want to live in and could afford, mainly due north or due south of the centre. In Christmas 2009, we finally did get moved into London to Brockley. So you can see our head office, Steer's head office, is just behind the Oxo Tower off the banks of the River Thames. And we moved to Brockley at Christmas 2009. In May 2010, I got married, and my work colleagues bought us this special gift of 3 extracts of the island map. So hopefully you'll be able to see them behind me on the wall, but I've also done a little screenshot there so that people can see them in more detail. And these are the 3 picture frames that my colleagues bought us as a wedding present. So here's a little zoom in on the area I lived in from Stephen Walter's website, where you can view the map in detail. And I'll put these links in the chat once I finish my talk and the next guys are on, so you can zoom in and zoom out as your heart desires and investigate the areas that you know well. So yeah, we lived right in the corner of the crossroads of two railway lines, just by Crofton Park Station. And yeah, this is where I sort of started my journey from there. So I'm going to just go through a few of the highlights from the map that I think are quite general kind of highlights and give you a flavour for it. And then I'm going to go through some of the more personal ones and talk about what the memories that the map brings back for me. So first up here, Harry Beck was here, underground map in brackets. So a significant person when it comes to London and maps, of course. So here, his time when he lived in Finchley during the 1930s is marked on the map. And this is the time when he was making the famous London Underground map. So I thought that was only right to share where that is. And obviously that's what Stephen wanted to put on his map. On the top right, we have Stratford. So again, thinking about this was 2008, a snapshot before the Olympics came to London in 2012. So London was announced the winner for the 2012 Olympics in 2005, and therefore the ring's placement here is fairly accurate, as a lot of the scope planning had been completed by 2008. So Steer were working on the transport plans for the Olympics at the time, and I remember when I first started in 2008, they were already producing transport plans for those, and I got kind of involved in some of the latter stage competition venue arrangements for it up to sort of 2011, 2012. But it's nice to see and kind of remind ourselves of what actually was at Stratford before the Olympics. It's completely different, it's unrecognisable now. So that moves us on to the second one. So Wombles, no further information. We all know where that is, right? Without even having to think about it, we know what area of London we're talking about here. And I like the informal way that Stevens put it's Liz Bereford's Wombles, not Elizabeth, as I sort of Googled and was like, no, it is Elizabeth Beresford. I can't see any other reference to Liz, but that's his sort of informal addition to that. But we all know where that is. Twickers, so down in the bottom corner, on the bottom left. So dubious was his choice of site in 1906 that it was immediately dubbed Billy Williams' Cabbage Patch, evidently. So you just see to the right-hand side, top right-hand side of the rugby ball icon, Billy Williams' Cabbage Patch. And I was quite intrigued. I was like, what's this all about? What's that to do with? But yeah, it was back in the day, everybody sort of doubted that this was a good choice to put the national stadium of rugby, and it soon took off and it was where like England won their first game against Wales after like quite a drought period in like 1909, 1912, I think, and then obviously it all kind of like quieted down during the war years and then ramped up again with the bigger and better stadiums from there. So that's something I thought was really interesting because it's giving you that extra. It was something that I was really curious about and Googled it and obviously came up straight away. So it's great. And then the bottom right, legend. So flags to denote Little Italy, Little Cyprus, etc. I found that really fascinating that he's added all these flags in. Can't see if there's any. There's a few just on the edges of some of the extracts that I've shown here, but you'll see them all over the map when you go and explore it. So on to how I would rewrite the map. So top left again, I'll go first, is the Brockley Jack. So this is the pub that we first visited in 2008 during our trips visiting estate agents. And later would be the pub around the corner where I met the Brockley Knits ladies whilst I was on maternity leave between 2014 and 2015. So somewhere that I visited since I've moved to St Albans. I've still gone back to Crofton Park. It's on the Thameslink line, so it's quite easy to get to and from Brockley and Crofton Park back up to St Albans, and go down at Christmas to go and visit the Brockley Knit ladies at the Brockley Jack pub. Top right is the Cut. So this was the location of our pre-wedding drinks where I was actually handed these three amazing maps. So obviously that made it into into my final thing, and that's what I remember about that, and it brings back lots of memories of going out drinking with my work friends before I had to go and pick up kids. Bottom left, oh no, in the centre, sorry, is Barbican. That's a location where we watched my dad's favourite ever musical, Carousel, together. So I'll always treasure that area, and that's something that really brings back a lot of really lovely memories. Seeing his favourite musical there. Bottom left is Maritime Museum in Blackheath. So our first Maritime Museum visit was the day we found out we were pregnant. And Blackheath brings back lovely memories of fireworks nights that we used to walk to from home back in Crofton Park, as the roads were always so busy. So we were like, we might as well just walk. And bottom right, Lido, in 2014, that's after having our first son in 2014, I spent many lunchtimes with the NHS mums group at the Brockwell Park Lido, wondering about how our tiny babies would turn out. So just a few memories of my own, evoked from the stuff that Stephen's done before. And now I've got a little video that I want to show you that Stephen is in and that Peter Barber from the British Library put together. There's lots more information on the British Library website that I've got a link to that I'll put in the chat, and the bottom link there you can go on to, if you use stephenwalter.org, you can get access to the virtual view of the whole map, and you can zoom in and out yourself and explore it more. So I will swap over now and show you the video.
London is the place that I grew up and that I identify as my city. I see the place as this pulsating, vast grey magnet that draws so many people and cultures in. I wanted to create a piece about London as an icon, and much of London's atmosphere and history comes from it being in some way separate from the rest of the country. And so creating it into an island meant that it was more of an icon with its fictitious coastline and in some way a place in itself.
He has a lot of personal information, autobiographical information on the map, which, normally speaking, you wouldn't get, though you could argue that any map, to an extent, tells you something about the person who made it.
A lot of the references are about personal experiences in certain places. In Trent Park here, when we were growing up, big group of friends, we used to make fires and spend all night here, really. The tree line that you see on the left would be the line of the fictitious coastline of London on the map. And also down there is the manor house of old Middlesex University that was a POW camp in the Second World War, and Charlie Chaplin and Churchill were famous for visiting there.
The island is a conventional map in that it shows the different parts of London in more or less accurate relationship to one another. It's underlying it all, there's an accurate street plan. More than that, it gives information about London which can best be represented graphically.
The interest in signs and symbols has grown up in my work in the last decade, of looking at landscapes and representations of real experiences onto a perceived landscape. And maps have been something that I've always been fascinated in looking at.
I especially like Stephen Walter's Map of London because I feel it does very similar things to town plans which have been produced for the last 1,000 years. It's a map which is made up almost entirely of symbols with a key to direct us to what the symbols mean. It's basically a vast array of information in symbolic form.
John Roke's historical maps of London and other 18th century examples were a great influence into the appearance of the map. Mine goes from that conservative edge into a spoof of one of those historical maps of old, and highlights in certain areas some of the urban myths and the facts and fictions and the secrets and histories of certain places. This is my London studio in Fish Island in the Hackney Wick area, and this is where I made the map. In front of here we have the original drawing. From the start to the final mark, it took me about a year and a half. That included a great deal of research, internet-based, and books, etc. And from the initial photograph of a map of London and a projection, I traced the outlines of all the main roads, the built-up areas and the green spaces. So I would often start with a couple of processes of top left to bottom right, filling in the details of some of the centres of all the hamlets of London, and then start to fill in all the words. And then from then, as and when the information came to me, I travelled around the different areas of the map, filling in the detail.
The British Library purchased this map, and it's been a great addition to the collection. It shows London in a slightly different way to many usual maps. In addition to the roads and the key buildings and places of interest, it also shows the underbelly of London, if you will. Key events that have happened there, key events that have occurred and happened to the mapmaker himself. And in many ways it's doing the same thing as medieval world maps, which show what actually happened in a place as well as what the place looks like.
It notes some of the famous sites of history, such as Newgate Prison, where the convicted were marched off to be hung at the three-legged Tyburn tree, which is now Speaker's Corner. At some time in history, when an earthquake occurred in London, fish were reported to be jumping out of the Thames. Also, it notes Magna Carta Island in Runnymede, which is one of the islands shown on the map. We're standing outside the Charles Lamb pub in Islington, where one of the prints of the island is framed and hung. And here, in 2007, myself and Hobby Lemon, who runs the pub and also Tag Fine Arts, we decided to go ahead with the project of turning my original London drawing into an exhibition of prints.
What I most enjoy about the map is it's the way in which it subverts the language of photography. Everybody knows that a map uses signs. Everybody knows that a map has words. With Stephen Walter, the signs he uses might strike many people as being bizarre. They're certainly tremendously subjective. And the words, too, are words which you wouldn't find on any official map. And I think this actually adds to the value.
Examples of the information he shows are where dangerous dogs are in London and where to avoid them, where to get a good drink and where to have a nice view as you're having that drink, places to avoid at a certain time of night. In a way, this map is, I suppose I think of it as a tourist map, but it's a tourist map for the Londoner, for the insider.
The reactions to the map have been very positive, and I feel that people also have a bit of ownership and interest personally about the things that are referenced. A lot of the notes on the map are both caustic and humorous, serious and flippant, because the map and its references and really what it's about are about a shared history, and the piece acts as a mirror onto its viewer.
An earlier map by MacDonald Gill of 1920 showing London has similarly quite a few colloquial sayings which are virtually incomprehensible to us today, and one feels that Stephen Walter's map will probably be the same in 50 years. However, it will still be probably one of the most valuable documents we have of exactly how London was and what it was like in 2009.
So I hope you're all there still. Thank you for indulging and watching that. Hopefully you can hear me still all right as well. I couldn't have put it better myself, hence why I sort of showed that video. And if I say go and watch the video afterwards, you probably wouldn't. So I made you watch it now as part of this and hear from Stephen Walter and people from the British Library as well. So yes, apologies for only doing a 10-minute talk and then a 10-minute video, but hopefully it brought it all together then, and you enjoyed that.
Thank you very much, Claire. That was a interesting map, and it was the giving all the context from the video really helped a lot, because it was a fairly spectacular project. It looks like that they produced, and it's genuinely well worth you showing us this. So I have to say again, anyone that wants to ask Claire any questions, please put them in the chat, and she'll get them before she disappears off. So again, thank you very much, Claire, for that. That's been really worthwhile hearing. So I'd like to now pass us over to Richard.
So thank you, Chris, for that introduction. Thanks to BCS for an opportunity to talk with you this evening. Getting into a habit, I think, with some of these. It's another atlas, one of its time, and one that I hope will, in what you see and hear, show that we don't have to think something is perfect throughout in every single way to understand its value and overall quality. So I'd grown up with a view as to what a map is. There we have it. Stafford, 7th Series Ordnance Survey, 1 inch. Even if the printing that we had at the time didn't show the road I lived on. But that was that. And then, yeah, typically we'd buy another 50,000 map to take away for a summer holiday so we could explore where we were. And schools had things like this on the wall. However, then my parents' eyes lit on this. The perfect way to broaden the perspective of me and my sister. So some of the things I say are the eyes of a 10-year-old who first saw it. The others almost 60 years later as I revisit it. It has everything from a satellite view. What a satellite view was when I first opened it, through to detailed employment statistics. It's not just the stat that there is many thematics, as you get in many atlases, but there's new ways of showing them. Clearly, in some ways, the editors themselves couldn't think of a satellite view either, as the opening section, the nature of the land, is described as being a view one would have from an aircraft flying about 300 miles above the Earth. Not a satellite, an aircraft. Gives a view of the topography and some indication of the major settlements. But there are a few odd selections. Stafford, where I had lived, no longer shown, but a much smaller Whitchurch is. And quite what Abereren does, one of the major conurbations of the British Isles, I'm not sure, when Llanelli is removed. And there are several other slightly interesting choices going on, but this is what it looks like in a bit more detail. And for those of you who are aficionados of the road network, you'll notice that it's the A30 depicted running down to the southwest, not the 303. And perhaps for the last time, urban areas can be depicted just as uniform grey. Looking at modern satellite and aerial mapping, you realise that most places these days are surrounded by a necklace of white, large sheds for retail or industrial purposes. Section 2 comes on to the country we live in, and this apparently is what it looks like. Topographic mapping at 6 miles to the inch. One of the first things that might strike you is just how recessive some of the items are. Rivers, railways, not minor roads, perhaps especially depending on the shading behind them, almost disappearing. I'm left wondering whether it's a stroke of genius to enhance the overall indication of the structure, or just a failure to achieve the right balance. I can't help but feel that the overall effect is to push the main road network to the foreground. This is North Worcestershire, extending southwest from Birmingham, where I was living at the time. As a design, it seems to improve as the relief increases. Here we can see Dartmoor with some nice hill shade, and as the elevation increases, here's the very Snowdon area. It starts to look a little better too. I took a closer look at the area where I now live, and I couldn't help but notice 40 years working at the UK Hydrographic Office does inculcate a checking mentality into one, if nothing else. Couldn't help but notice how the minor road network just around here has some very strange selections and choices. Significant routes omitted while smaller lanes included. Sections left hanging, and there appear to be several places where other layers have been blanked, as indicated here, to allow the roads to be shown, but then the roads aren't there. And others where some tiny little lanes are shown, but there are blanks where larger connecting roads should be shown. Interesting choices, but enough of that. Time for the largest section in the book. The fabric of the nation, or as we would perhaps more typically call it, a lot of thematic mapping. And again, an odd choice of words. Fabric of a nation, but almost all of the information depicted covers two nations, the United Kingdom and Ireland. It's expressed in impressive contents list though. But just to remind ourselves of how far things have progressed, this is the one satellite image chosen to show what the British Isles look like from space. This is 11 AM on the 31st of August 1964 by the Nimbus A satellite. Not much detail to be shown. Section starts with a history of the British Isles from the very earliest times. Strangely, this map forms part of the first section of the atlas. And returning to it as a geologist, I found the selection lacking, perhaps, oversimplified in some areas, but less detail than you'd find in a typical school atlas. If you're looking to wonder what the structure of the wheels is like, you won't find it here. Indeed, the only geological period that's subdivided is the Carboniferous, which I rather assume reflects the absolute importance of coal in the 1960s. You may also notice that while the Orkneys made it onto the page, the Shetlands didn't quite do so. Indeed, as we go through the atlas, both island groups are perhaps more often absent than shown. However, we start to get some of the ways that the editors are trying to contextualize information. These block diagrams can tell the uninitiated an awful lot more than a geological map. Section 3 does include these postcards, if you like, from the past. Roughly what was happening for each of the main geological periods. Help us all, specialists as well as non-specialists. It's worth noting that while there's a mention of drifting opening up the Atlantic, we're still too early for plate tectonics. And similarly, in terms of how far our geological view has been refined, here we just have the lumpen Precambrian. None of its current subdivisions. We move on through time. Here's the just indication of what one of them looked like. So you get a rough map, a postcard of what it could have looked like, some information, and a few drawings of some of the more typical fossils that have survived. As we move on through time, we have various maps, the Romans, and then how things were during World War II, especially focusing on the Battle of Britain. There are some D-Day and the Battle of the Atlantic, and that's it for history. But remember that D-Day was closer to the Atlas publication than we are to the start of this century. as we start to think about our place in the solar system and all sorts of things, we have an interesting diagram. It's useful to explain how, yes, the sun doesn't always rise in the east or set in the west, but it's slightly disconcerting to perhaps visualize the sun just over the mid-Atlantic. We have plenty of information on the weather, the climate. Here's dates of first air frost. So we have to note the age of the sources, 1911 to 1930. Wasn't exactly new when the book was first published. And then adding to this, something of what drives the climate, the ocean currents. Here we have a nice depiction of those. We move on to nature and we look at what is actually sea fisheries. So it's a nice map of the seabed, the near fishing grounds. A separate map gives an indication of the distances travelled to the still then many and plentiful distant fishing areas. How many trawlers would be setting sail, not just for Newfoundland, far north, very much reduced these days. Cod wars and Iceland played a part in that. I wonder what a modern map of distant fishing grounds would look like. Then we have inshore fisheries, or inland fisheries, which is actually a river catchment map labelled with typical fish that can be found on there, on each of those catchments. It gives a good impression of how the country is drained, which sea you'll get to from various different places. More nature. Here we get a sort of start to see the presentational theme. We'll encounter again lots of detail, but some ways to contextualize that information, and an indication of where some of these species spend other times of the year. We move on to human geography. This is population densities of the early 1960s. And as you can see, most of this, as with most of the information, it covers both the UK and Ireland. And then we have people themselves. So physical characteristics, religion, language. This is the distribution of blood groups, and a whole page on language and dialect. Main feature being mapping of characteristic word use and pronunciation. So how current this was even in the 1960s might be open to debate. Were we really saying Z and Varmer back then down here in the southwest? And just to whet your appetite, here's the various uses of the words for what I would still think of as a cowshed. The atlas moves on to think about some of the systems we created. Not all mapping, as this outline of what was then the legal system can show. And then for a 10-year-old, wonders of wonders, a map that's not graphic. This is showing all of the parliamentary constituencies of the time as an equal area. Though it does go on to note that actual sizes varied, and in Scotland and Wales they were systematically smaller, while those in Northern Ireland were larger. And then farm use at the time, perhaps a more varied view than you'd have today. There were also many little maplets showing the production of crops and numbers of animals to be found in different parts of the country. Transport from airways to inland waterways, together with a rail network perhaps denser than today's, well, considerably denser than today's, and a road system rather thinner, especially regarding its motorways and similar styles. Marine navigation even gets in a little mention, though it's mostly lights and lifeboat stations. And it's not clear why this page goes off north to show this. And I found when I was looking for some sort of explanation maybe that strikes me that there are none of the maps in this section have information about scale or projection or anything technical like that. In closing this section, we get an insight into the nature of industry in those days, which was mainly a focusing on manufacturing. These are days when we still made stuff. It's shocking, perhaps, to realize how different this would be if recast today. Certain areas stand out here. Engineering, shipbuilding, car manufacturing, and perhaps one of the most telling of all, textiles, with an absolute preponderance of cotton in Lancashire, wool in Yorkshire. Again, a map that will be very different if done today. Minerals are very much extractive industries. A salutary reminder how much we've changed and how much it was driven by coal in those days. I'd be interested to know how many of its inhabitants realised there was coal mining in what today will be thought of as central Bristol. I'll end with perhaps another map which epitomises the atlas's strengths. Shows the distribution of building stone and illustrates the impact that had on construction styles and methods in those places. A fourth section of the atlas was generally non-map. There was the usual gazetteer, many statistical summaries for each county, again, both countries. There were at the time apparently 246 primary schools in Somerset. There were also just 34 universities, 9 of which had been founded in the 1960s. There was, before we got to any maps, there had been an entire page of thanks to the various contributors. And there was at the end, another page in fair detail acknowledging all those who had provided information or helped. And of interest to us today, particular naming of the artists, cartographers and model makers who contributed to the atlas. And there was lots more in there I've not been able to mention. Recreation, folklore, places where famous people had lived, died, or simply been born. So what makes it special? Partly it's sheer breadth, but more I think it's that desire to contextualize the information that was shown. Oh, and as a bonus, there was a separate sheet with a reproduction of Mercator's view of these islands from 1595. So, did this all get me into cartography as a profession? Sadly, no. Rather, that was through working with what is now the Mission to Seafarers in Rotterdam as a postgraduate. That made a job advert for the UKHO stand out from what were then the crowded jobs pages of the Sunday papers. Thank you. Well, that one.
Thank you very much, Richard. That's been a genuinely very interesting talk, and interesting choice, and very interesting.
Yes, I've not seen any examples of this in secondhand bookshops or charity shops recently, but it's if you do see one, it is a trove of things to relive the 1960s.
No, it was interesting to see, interesting to share.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to pass us now over to our final speaker. So Nick, are you ready?
I'm ready, and I will share my screen. Well, I'd like to begin by thanking BCS for inviting me along this evening to share my map memoirs with you. And also, what a terrific first two presentations. I'm a great big Stephen Walter fan, as many people will know. So for Claire to share that with us. That was absolutely magnificent. And Richard's presentation brings back so many memories of my youth and that particular volume. And as coincidence would have it, we may be looking at something fairly similar in this presentation. But what I've decided to do this evening is follow the Mick Ashworth lead, and it's Mick's second mention of the evening. And I've picked two particular maps to talk about. I couldn't make up my mind which one to go for, and the thinking behind my selection is very much, one, a map which had a profound influence on myself personally and influenced what I've done in my life subsequently. And the second map is a map which I witnessed having a profound impact on other people in a way which was somewhat unexpected. So I think they're two great stories. And bearing that in mind, let's begin, shall we? And we'll kick off with this pair of images. I want to go back to my childhood. I guess I'd be 5, 6 years old, in Manchester, and popping downstairs one morning and finding a large volume on the floor of the living room. And on the cover of the volume is what you see on your right. But what I saw was something akin to what we see on the left, the vase and two faces. Do you see two faces in black, or do you see a white vase? And I remember looking at this image, and what I saw was more of the gold rather than the green. I distinctly remember seeing that, and it meant no sense to me. I didn't know what I was looking at. I thought, what's that? And I lost interest and moved away, trotted off. No interest whatsoever. A couple of weeks later, same thing happened. I came down, and what I saw was the outline of the continents. I knew, for some reason, I knew what the continents looked like, and maybe it was the strange projection. But all of a sudden, I thought, hello, this looks like a map. I think I like maps. Do I like maps? I'm not sure. So it's the Reader's Digest again, except this is the Great World Atlas. And I think this edition dates from 1962. So it's pretty much the same size, dimension-wise, as the British Atlas, which Richard has just shown us. So the Great World Atlas, there we see quite a hefty tome for a little lad like myself. It was enormous. And I couldn't wait to open it up and find out what was in there. And this is what I remember seeing very early on that weekday morning, opening up, and I saw this. And it was this particular opening that blew my mind. It was the combination of colours, the bold writing, the sea, the forest or jungle, the desert. I couldn't get over the displacement of the colours and how vivid and how brilliant it looked. It drew me in. It was this particular opening. The next one in the volume is Southern Africa. I think previously there was Europe, but that was too green for me. This had more of a colour, a range of colours. So look at this. You can see places like Dahomey and Upper Volta, which gives you an idea as to the vintage of the Atlas. But the offsetting of the reds, the national boundaries, the forestry, the savannah, a hint towards the top of this image and maybe a bit of southern Sahara and the desert. The colours were all that did for me. I just had to keep looking and looking and looking. But every time I would come back to this particular opening. There we are again. And you can see moving over to more of Central Africa and more of East Africa. So Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. The rest of the Atlas had a similar flavour to the British Atlas, which Richard showed. We had lots of maps of different countries, more political maps, and then lots of thematic material in the back of the volume. it was fascinating to a little kid looking at it and thinking, what's it all about? I really liked this. I liked what I saw, and I was inspired to go away, go to school, get my traditional geographer's tools out of my crayons or wax colouring pencils, and start making my own maps at school. I was smitten, and let's face it, the bug hasn't gone away. This is what brought cartography into my life, and I am forever grateful. The atlas disappeared. Don't know what happened. And about 20 years ago, I just happened to be at the local primary school where I live, and they were doing a bric-a-brac sale. And lo and behold, what was in the sale but this particular atlas? So I had to buy it, didn't I? And there it is, snapped up. And I look at it on a regular basis and think, wow, this is special. Now, this has got absolutely nothing to do with the atlas whatsoever. I want to move on to my second map. But before I do so, I've just realized I've forgotten to tell you a story about the previous one. So excuse me, and I'm just going to go back to the previous one. What we do with my in-laws' families, we play these regular games or parlor game type things where you pick either your favorite or your least favorite of a certain thing, and a theme is announced. And in a game we played last year, this is 3 generations, you had to announce your favorite book. People were talking at great length about classic novels, all sorts of different things. Of course, I went for the Reader's Digest Atlas of the World, and I was able to argue the case that were it not for that particular atlas, then the game we were playing couldn't possibly have taken place, because I wouldn't have met my wife, who I met at work, and wouldn't have known anybody else around the room, and therefore we couldn't have all been assembled in the same place. We wouldn't have gone on holidays to the same place. It's this thing like a butterfly flapping its wings in the forest, and what moves on to happen next. So that's the story there. The influence of this atlas is profound. So there we go. But this has got nothing to do with the atlas. I'm taking you now to Central Asia, and this is the Fan Mountains in Tajikistan. And I had the great pleasure to travel to Tajikistan. I don't know whether you can see my cursor, but if you can, this little lobe to the northwest of Dushanbe in Tajikistan is where the Fan Mountains are. And I went trekking there in the mid-1990s. I've always wanted to go to Central Asia. I saw a holiday advertised in The Guardian. I thought, I'm going to go for this. It'd be a great thing to do. And we flew into Tashkent. We spent a few days in Samarkand, and then ended up in a place called Penji Kent, which is just across the border in Tajikistan, awaiting a truck which was going to take us up into the mountains and to base camp. And something went wrong. Things always went wrong on that holiday, and the truck didn't turn up. It was supposed to turn up in the middle of the afternoon, and we were billeted in the Palace of Culture in Penji Kent, and there were maybe about 15 of us in this great hall, and we sat in the room and waited and drank lots of tea. But the one thing that struck me about this room was this huge photograph on the wall, and it was a huge photograph of Dunstanburgh Castle in Northumberland. And as one of my favourite places on the planet, that completely blew me away and put me in great mood for the rest of the holiday. But this is the map I want to talk about. You may not have seen it. I very much suspect you won't have. It's the map of the Fan Mountains in Tajikistan. And it's a folding map, front cover on the right, back cover on the left. We will zoom in. There it is. That's the part of the Kulikalon Lakes, I believe, way up in the mountains. And we went trekking around there. Gorgeous, as stunning as it looks on the cover. This is the back. This isn't the Bodleian copy, by the way, so all the dirty smudges are actual practical map use in the field. The map is produced by an outfit called EWP, or Earth Wilderness Programme or Project, who were based in Worthing and then moved up to Goring, just south of Oxford. And they ran a variety of holidays, trekking holidays, and you can see to East Africa. You can see some of the titles on the right there. And they produce their own maps for their punters to take on their holidays, to use whilst they're on holiday. They were also very good, wearing my map librarian's hat on, as depositors in terms of legal deposits. So for the 6 legal deposit libraries, such as the Bodleian where I'm based, then the maps would arrive, and they arrived in far better condition than this, I can guarantee that. And this is what the map looked like. You unfold it and you can see 1 to 100,000 scale. I'm not expecting you to pick up many details on here, but note the blue lakes and the orange contours. This is a very mountainous area. There are no major settlements here at all, just odd little villages. And having left the Palace of Culture under the cover of darkness, we were driven eventually up into the mountains in this very dodgy looking van, pitch black, and our tents had already been pitched. Half the group had gone up early. And in the morning, I woke up and the view on the left is what I saw, this gorgeous looking lake. I thought, wow, this is a bit special, isn't it? And we started walking, and we walked to the left of the lake, to the left of the lake and somewhere up this valley, and then climbed up to this spot here where we had lunch. So bear in mind, this is where we're having lunch. Few British tourists, a couple of Russian guides, I believe. Let's leave it at that. And we'll go back to a bit of cartography first. This is a Soviet 1 to 200,000 sheet covering the same area, dating from 1988. It's from the Bodleian. Have a look at it. I don't want you to take it in any great detail, but you can see the colour scheme is pretty much the same of the Fan Mountains map that I showed you. And again, this is the extract of the Soviet map. This is the lake, I think, that we looked at. The campsite was somewhere around here. And just to the west of Tavasang Pass is where we stopped for lunch. So bottom is the Soviet map, and above is the EWP map. And you can see there are, I've rescaled them so they're roughly the same size, but you can see there are distinct similarities. And possibly the main reason for this is that EWP were teamed up with an outfit called Geographic Bureau based in St. Petersburg. And the Geographic Bureau team had a number of cartographers in their midst, and they adapted the Soviet maps that they knew into something like this. So, and we walked up past Kiogli, this little hamlet, and into this kind of ravine area where we stopped for lunch. There it is again. So you can see nothing desperately sophisticated, but at least the cartographers have converted the map into something that, as a non-native Russian speaker or reader, we can read all the toponyms. The cartography isn't epic by any stretch of the imagination, but you could navigate quite safely. So going back to these two pictures, we stopped for lunch here, and all around at a distance, we noticed lots of small children, probably aged somewhere between 7 and 12. Say a dozen children. They were chattering away, but all quite separate and standing here, there and everywhere. And we thought, wouldn't it be nice to try and speak to these kids? And we beckoned to the kids. Would they come along? No, they weren't interested. Offer them some food? No. They weren't prepared to engage at all. We had some Russian speakers, but I don't think they spoke Russian. They spoke Tajik or Uzbek. And then, as if by magic, lo and behold, I got my map of the Fan Mountains out and held it out, opened it up, and they could see from a distance the bright blue and the orange, and they all slowly moved towards me. And this was rather wonderful. And they looked at the map. They couldn't read it, but they started pointing to the bright blue and naming the lakes. They knew where the lakes were. They had correctly identified them all. They gave names, and the names matched the names which I could read. They pointed to the mountain peaks. And all of a sudden, this map, this wonderful map, which was basically a tourist thing for us to travel around, had brought all these kids along, and they were engaging with our group. And we were just able to communicate in a way, and it was all down to the map, for which I will be forever grateful. It was great to see the power of cartography in action in such a way. So there's the cover once again, and it just brings me to conclude, really. In my opinion, this map is no classic map, far from it, but its impact as a tool for communication demonstrated to me the pure strength of maps and cartography in as graphic and as compelling a manner as I've ever witnessed. It was really rather moving. The map won't win any awards. It won't sell in huge numbers, I shouldn't imagine. I think it's out of print now. But for one fleeting moment, it brought together two very different cultures who previously had been powerless to interact, but cartography had drawn them in. It brought us together where language could not. And I thought that was a very, very interesting juxtaposition. And it leaves me just to compare the two maps and the type of consumers there are for cartography out there. The Reader's Digest is a mass marketed, almost expected thousands of people to use it and look at it, and to look at the map, ingest it, digest it, and breathe in the cartography. The EWP map of the Fan Mountains, a few hundred users perhaps, and I would imagine that none of the maps makers would have expected it to have such a profound effect as it did on me and our small group of trekkers back in the 1990s. So with that, I would like to wrap up and just say thank you for your time, and I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. That's been a nice, interesting story, and a nice run through two different options there. So, we'd just like to quickly drop into the Q&A for anyone. So, if anyone has any questions, please drop them in the chat, and we'll work our way to them. But for now, I'll go through the few questions that we've got. So. It was a question for Richard. It's a quick way from Jim. It was how many pages in total were there in the atlas, if you know?
I do, because I have a copy of it sat next to me here. 230 pages in all, and what I forgot to say at the start was each page is just over A3 in size. So what I've never done is try to count them every single map that's shown, because whereas some are whole page ones, some pages have got 25 maps on, things like that. So quite a variation. But yeah, it's a substantial volume. It's about a third as thick as my my edition of the Great World Atlas is. So I think I've only got mine's a second edition, Nick, I think, rather than your first.
I'm not sure what is it. I think mine might be a second edition as well, actually.
Oh well, it's a very it gets interesting when we're starting to compare the various editions of atlases. I think of the small pile I've now got of the Times Atlas. That's that's slowly growing in a corner. Okay, yes, I can see the comments that we've got. That other people recall the Atlas, Richard. That's seems to make another impact there. And again, from Jim, it's the fact of the power of, got to love the power of cartography. So I think that was again, that story was a very interesting one there. And so yes, I have to say it's been genuinely interesting it's genuinely interesting hearing the three individual stories and how they've all had a genuine impact on yourselves. How these maps have all played an important role, and I can see genuinely that all the comments we get, it is reflecting this. I think these talks always give a genuine good view of cartography and how it plays a role among everyone else. So, yes, I have to say thank you very much for both. Thank you very much for your talks. And I think I'll bring it to a close now. So I want to once again, thank both our speakers. That's, well, all three speakers. You've all given us some genuinely interesting things to look at and to think about, and ultimately, and I want to thank everyone for joining us as usual. It's always good to see a good audience come up and see the Teatime Talks. So our next talk is going to be from Neil Archer, and it's going to be about the Defence Geographic Centre. But I want to say to everyone, thank you and goodbye for now.